Anybody feeling just a tiny bit uncomfortable? Why? There was supposed to have been sound right there, and it wasn't happening. And felt awkward. At least it can if you're thinking about it. Isn't it curious that a little bit of silence can make us uncomfortable? Silence. Sometimes silence is good, sometimes silence is not so good. In my first year of teaching, I can remember silence bothering me some. I grew up in a family of 8 children. Didn't have a lot of silence. I hadn't met Kayla yet. I'd come home to my 25-foot travel trailer on the wind-swept steppes of northern Iowa, and there I'd be. I can remember having the impulse to turn on anything that would make noise all at once. Radio, record player, whatever I could think of. Of course, I didn't do that very long. It wasn't really just sound I was craving. Sometimes silence is a good thing. Maybe you're tired and you need rest. Quiet can be a relief. Or maybe we've been working hard, rubbing shoulders with people all week long, and it feels restful to go and walk by a lake or take a walk in the woods in the quiet, away from the noise. Sometimes silence is not good. Sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes it's gut-wrenching. Waiting in the lobby outside an operating room. Waiting for word, and the time goes by. Will the surgeon come with news? When will he come? Is she going to be okay? Is he going to be okay? Or will he tell you, I'm sorry, there's nothing more we can do? And maybe the longer you have to wait in that silence, the more likely the news is bad. Silence. Have you ever, in your Christian experience, felt like God was silent when you especially needed him? Now, it's true, God communicates to us through the Bible, through prayer, through godly people we can talk to, even through nature. But there's times, for most of us, when these sources don't feel like enough. Even though God has provided all of this for us, there are times we want more specific direction from him. Maybe what's happening doesn't match our expectations of what a Christian life is supposed to include. And there are times when so much depends on making the right decision, and we just don't know what it is. Or maybe you need special, unusual help. God performs miracles, and you need a miracle. What about when he doesn't perform one for you? What about when you ask and he seems to be just silent? We're not alone in these feelings. People have asked this question throughout the history of the earth. What should we do? What does it mean when it feels like God is silent? There were some times in the Bible when God communicated directly, unmistakably, extremely clearly. When the 10 Commandments were given on Mount Sinai, you could hear the very voice and words of the creator of the universe. Was that enough for the children of Israel? Did that direct, clear guidance keep them walking in God's will and making the right choices? It should have. It should have been enough. It was just a few days later. They'd made an idol, a golden calf, and they were worshiping it. Having things clear and obvious apparently is not enough. Many times throughout the history of the world, God or his angels have audibly spoken to or given visions to individuals. The ones we know the most about are the prophets: Enoch, Moses, Daniel, many others. Today in 2019, however, we don't seem to be receiving very much of this kind of extremely direct communication from God. And it can feel to us that compared to Bible times, God's rather silent. Actually, though, it appears that even in the Bible, there were times when God was more silent than at other times. In the story of the boy Samuel, reading from the book of 1 Samuel 3, verse 1, it says, "Now the boy Samuel ministered to the Lord before Eli, and the word of the Lord was rare in those days." There was no widespread revelation. So there were times in the Bible when they experienced the same thing. And I've tried to kind of track where the miracles of the Bible fell, and it does seem they often came in clumps. We can see in the Bible how God especially spoke to the prophets. But we can also see in the Bible people who sought help or answers from God, and for them God seemed to be silent. One of those was Job. In that book of Job, chapter 1, verse 1, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and shunned evil. And 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. Also his possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large household, so that this man was greatest of all the people in the East. Job had experienced God's blessings. God had made him prosperous. He'd made him respected. But then some things happened that Job had no way of knowing about. In verse 6, "Now there came a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, 'From where do you come?' So Satan answered the Lord and said, 'From going to and fro on the earth and from walking back and forth on it.' Then the Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil?' So Satan answered the Lord and said, 'Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge around him and around his household and around all that he has on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But now, stretch out your hand and touch all he has, and he will surely curse you to your face.' The Lord said to Satan, 'Behold, all he has is in your power, only do not lay a hand on his person.' So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord." Satan then, with God's permission, destroyed every blessing Job and his wife had. Oxen, donkeys, sheep, camels, sons and daughters. Verse 20, "Then Job arose, tore his robe, and shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshipped. And he said, 'Naked I came from my mother's womb, naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.' In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong." In the second chapter of Job, Satan gets permission to attack Job's health. So Satan answered the Lord, this is verse 4 of chapter 2. Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin. Yes, all a man has he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he's in your hand, but spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with painful boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, and he took for himself a potsherd. It's a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women speak. Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Now, this doesn't mean Job didn't question God, because Job didn't feel he was being treated justly. But when Job prayed, what he felt was God's silence. While talking to his friends, Job said in chapter 19, verse 7, "If I cry out concerning my wrong, I am not heard. If I cry aloud, There is no justice. He has fenced up my way so that I cannot pass. He has set darkness in my paths. In the same chapter, Job still shows silence hasn't destroyed his faith, though. Verse 25, I know that my Redeemer lives, and he shall stand at last in the earth. And after my skin is destroyed, this I know, that in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself. Chapter 23, Job is again expressing his frustration that God is still silent. Chapter 23, verse 2, even today my complaint is bitter. My hand is listless because of my groaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find him. Again in the same chapter, he still expresses his belief that despite the silence, it's going to come out okay in the end. Verse 10, he knows the way I take, and when he has tested me, I shall come forth as gold. That was a statement of faith because God still had not spoken. God finally does speak in chapters 38 through 41. But what does God say there? Instead of answering Job's questions, instead of telling him why he is suffering, in some of the most poetic verses of the Bible, for 4 chapters, God gives example after example of things that Job cannot comprehend. After saying in verse 2, who is this that darkens counsel without knowledge? God goes on to say, in verse 4 of chapter 38, Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? In other words, Job, is it reasonable for you to sit in judgment on my actions when you're not witness to all I've been involved in? When you don't know everything I know? Verse 8, he asks Job, who shut in the sea with doors? Was that you, Job? Job, do you understand why the sea stays where it does? Why doesn't the sea come up and flood the land? We might, we think of that. The truth is we don't understand it either. Of course, we talk about gravity, and gravity is what keeps it down there and keeps it from rising up. We don't understand what gravity really is. We talk about it. We teach about it. We even have equations we write to quantify what's happening with gravity. But gravity itself, what is it? Why does it have that effect upon mass? Why does it pull? We don't know. The greatest scientists in the world don't know. They're coming up with theories, but they're unproven. They're just theories. We still don't understand gravity. So our answer to God to this question would have to be the same as Job's. I don't know. Verse 31, can you bind the cluster of the Pleiades? The Pleiades are a cluster of stars that are one group of stars. You see them in the night sometimes of the year. The 7 sisters, you ever seen them? Those are the Pleiades. And apparently Job looked at them too, and they had the same name for them, or a similar name at least. Can you bind the cluster of the Pleiades? Those stars are 440 light years away. Job, are you able to keep these stars bound together so they don't fly apart and separate? Or Job, is this too big a problem for you to solve or understand? In these chapters, when God is asking Job questions, God's seeming to say, Job, there's many, many things you're not going to be able to understand. And by implication, we along with Job, we can realize that just as the wonders of creation are beyond Job's or our comprehension, just so the mysteries of life on this sinful earth may also often be beyond our comprehension. And you know what? Job never finds out why he's suffering, because God never tells him. And how does Job respond to God's questioning? Chapter 42, verse 1, Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. You asked, 'Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge?' Therefore I uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Listen, please, and let me speak. You said, 'I will question you, and you shall answer me.' I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes." Does the fact that God never answered Job's questions directly mean that God didn't love Job? No. The Bible makes it very clear God did love Job very much, because God was silent on the cause of Job's suffering. Does that mean Job had nothing from God to help him in his distress? No. Through Job's entire life, before and especially after, God was Job's friend. But in the end, Job recognizes that God doesn't tell us all the reasons why we suffer. God doesn't tell us everything we want to know. God did bless Job again, and he restored him. But while Job was suffering, and even afterward, God was silent about why he was going through this trial. Sometimes all we will be able to do is to trust him. Often it won't be until heaven that we will understand why we suffered. Even Jesus, God's own Son, experienced silence from God the Father. Matthew 27, verse 46. As Jesus was dying, his words were, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In that time of what Jesus felt his greatest need, God the Father was silent. They'd spent Jesus' whole lifetime communing together, but at this time, when Jesus felt a great need for contact with his Father, God was silent. If God's own Son had to endure God's silence, surely we should not be surprised if we also must sometime experience God's silence as well. When Job suffered, God the Redeemer vindicated him and restored him during his lifetime. Job became even more rich than he had been before. His position in society became more respected. This was the case for many Bible characters, and it will often be the case for we who live in modern times. If you live God's way, things usually go much better. How often we find that those who live by God's principles reach the end of life more prosperous, more respected, and more loved than someone who's lived by evil principles. Joseph experienced God's silence while he spent 2 years in an Egyptian prison. But then God honored Joseph's faith, and it suited God's purpose to make him ruler of all Egypt. Daniel may well have felt God's silence when his country was overrun and then conquered by the vicious Babylonian army. Very likely he watched as many of his neighbors and his friends and his family were killed or suffered mistreatment. We know what conquering armies often do. And armies of this period of history seemed especially cruel. They found special delight in making your suffering as painful and humiliating as possible. And then after all this, Daniel was probably forced to make a prison march under terrible conditions all the way to Babylon. That distance, if we were to walk the same distance, that would be having to walk from here to Colorado, or from here to West Virginia, or from here through the rest of Missouri north, across the state of Iowa, and across the entire length of Minnesota, all the way to Canada. That's the distance he had to walk on that death march, prison march, to Babylon. Do you think Daniel was feeling God's silence? But like Joseph, God honored Daniel's faith, his fidelity. He became prime minister of Babylon. And then when Persia conquered Babylon, almost more incredibly, he became one of the highest ministers in the Persian government. Daniel was so filled with the Spirit of God and the blessing of God But even these heathen kings completely trusted him. In the case of Job, Joseph, and Daniel, even though it felt like God was silent when they were crying for help, God was really there watching over them. But some who experience God's silence are not restored to the good life. Some do not have their reputations vindicated. They may die with nothing to sustain them but the Holy Spirit in their hearts and their faith in God. Jesus experienced this when he died. Think of the martyrs of history who died because they were determined to live by God's principles. Think as they stood in those Roman arenas and watched the lions approach. They could face them with the faith that God had given them, but it may very well be thought that God was silent about them. When World War II was over and the Allies were occupying Germany, in the city of Cologne after the war, it was found in the cellar of a house some writing on the wall. They have no idea who did the writing. And anyone who might have known who did the writing had apparently disappeared. And it's believed that this cellar was a place where Jews were probably hidden. They were hiding from the Gestapo. We don't know what happened to the Jews. We don't know what happened to those in the house who were hiding the Jews. But these words, these profound words, were written on that cellar wall. This person was expressing their faith while feeling the silence of God. This is the English translation. I believe in the sun, even when it is not shining. I believe in love, even when there's no one there. And I believe in God, even when he is silent. I believe through any trial there's always a way. But sometimes, in the suffering, in hopeless despair, my heart cries for shelter, to know someone's there. But a voice rises within me saying, hold on, my child. I'll give you strength. I'll give you hope. Just stay a little while. May there someday be sunshine. May there someday be happiness. May there someday be love. May there someday be peace. The stories of the Bible teach us that while we live on this sinful earth, it may very well be we sometimes feel like God is silent. This earth is a place where rebellion against God is being allowed to show its awful results. It's being shown that when evil is in power, the innocent suffer. When evil is in power, there's no justice. As this great conflict between Christ and Satan plays out, we can't always see what's going on in the background. We often can't see how our suffering, bad as it may be, will all work out for the best in the end. There's a quote from a very good book, The Desire of Ages. It's a devotional commentary on the life of Christ. I find this thought encouraging. It says, God never leads his children otherwise than they would choose to be led, if they could see the end from the beginning, and discern the glory of the purpose which they are fulfilling as co-workers with him. Not Enoch, who was translated to heaven, not Elijah, who ascended in a chariot of fire, was greater or more honored than John the Baptist, who perished alone in heaven. Unto you it is given, in the behalf of Christ, not only to believe on him, but also to suffer for his sake. Philippians 1:29. And of all the gifts that heaven can bestow upon men, fellowship with Christ in his sufferings is the most holy trust and the highest honor. So lest we despair when it feels like God is silent. God is still providing for us. Is there no hope for justice? Will there never be happiness for those unfortunate ones who experience the oppression of the evil one? No, because God has promised this is not going to go on forever. In Revelation, chapter 21, verse 1, John says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. There was no more sea. Then I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men. He will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. God himself will be with them and will be their God. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And there shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things passed away. Someday, when we reach the safety of heaven, and we're there fellowship with Jesus and with the angels, and with all the saints from this earth, we'll be able to look back and see that God in his mercy really did provide the help we need. When we suffered injustice, when we felt alone and without the support we wanted from God, we'll discover that even though it didn't feel like it, God was actually there taking care of us, providing what we really needed, not always in the ways that we wanted, not always in ways that were easy for us to see, but we'll realize he truly provided what we actually needed. Looking back on our experience, we will be able to affirm the words of the scripture that Ken read to us earlier, Psalms 9, verse 10. Those who know your name trust in you, for you, Lord, have never forsaken those who seek you. And someday as we experience the happiness of heaven surrounding us, we're going to be able to look back on these trials and difficulties that we face on this earth. We're going to be able to say with conviction, it was so worth it. God is just.